Greetings to our distinguished speakers and guests today. Welcome to Advance's second digital town hall, securing Australia's role in the global space industry. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of our land. I'm joining you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. We're all richer for understanding how first Australians used astronomy to inform their early navigation calendars to predict weather, and also to inform their laws, social structure and stories that have been passed down for generations. So I'm pleased to see that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island astronomy is now part of Australia's national curriculum. Thank you to all our speakers who you'll meet shortly, and the presenters who contributed to the video compilation you'll see in this program. We're honoured to be able to host such a wide variety of Australian experts from almost every facet of the space sector. I'm personally very excited to learn more about Australia's significant role in this sector. Advance is our network of global Australians. This network includes the 1 million global Australians currently working overseas and the 2.5 million international alumni who gained an Australian education. For nearly 20 years, Advance has worked to build a global diaspora network and keep this network connected professionally with Australia. Our endeavours have enjoyed consistent bipartisan government support, as well as sponsorship by Australian corporates and generous donors. At the heart of what we do is a belief in the positive soft power Australians can exert overseas and the immense talent dividend that Australia can gain. Each year, Advance hosts a global town hall on a topic of immediate relevance to Australia. It is an opportunity to bring together some of the greatest minds our diaspora have to offer and share their insights with decision makers in Australia. It's also an important opportunity to update our Advance members on industry developments in Australia. Last year, our first digital global town hall looked at Australia's advanced manufacturing industry and supply chain risks and opportunities for Australia as the pandemic took hold. Today's topic is just as prescient. The technological developments underpinning the space economy have flow-on effects for every other industry, and in particular, our investments in leading-edge technology. We know that Australia's opportunity to capitalise on this sector and deploy our efforts strategically will benefit a wide range of industries. In this town hall, our speakers will discuss the importance of Australia's space sector and examine the benefits for our economy. We'll learn about the advantages Australia has in this area, also some of the challenges we face, and the implications of our growing space industry across our economy. This is not just important for those who work in STEM or the space sector, but to all Australians. So to start things off, we're delighted to be hosting Jane Duke. Jane is Australia's Consul General based in Los Angeles. Jane will set the scene for understanding Australia's position in the global space industry, from our early relations with the US in the space race through to now. So welcome, Jane, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Yasmin. I'm delighted to be here with Advance for this digital town hall on space. Advancements in space technology are having a profound impact on improving our quality of life. From faster communications to weather forecasts and scientific discoveries, Innovations in space technology are helping our progress and understanding of our planet. Over the last 5 years, the global space sector has been energised by new money and new participants. Private commercial enterprises are entering the field, and government space programs are commissioning more services and products from them. In fact, the Bank of America thinks the space industry could be worth $1.4 trillion by 2030. These developments also have geostrategic implications, with space becoming a more contested and complex domain as countries want to ensure that their capabilities keep up with the technology. For over 60 years, Australia and the United States have shared an enduring space partnership. It's a little-known fact that Australia's space launch history dates back to the 1950s, with rocket launches from Woomera in South Australia, and that the first Australian satellite launch was in 1967, supported by the United States. Australia's Honeysuckle Creek tracking station and Parkes Radio telescope were critical to the success of the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. Our unique view of space allowed us to send TV images worldwide of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. Today, we continue to play a major role in NASA's exploration of space. Last month, in a milestone agreement with NASA, Australia's Prime Minister and the Minister for Science and Technology announced that an Australian-made rover will be included in a future mission to the moon. Leading Australian business and researchers will come together to develop the rover, backed by funding under the Australian Government's Moon to Mars initiative. The Moon to Mars initiative provides opportunities for Australia's commercial space sector to enter national and international supply chains that support NASA's mission. In other developments, NASA will be launching sounding rockets from Equatorial Launch in the Northern Territory in 2022. Australia has a number of strengths and advantages in space. We have a unique location to connect with space, expertise in robotics, sensors and automation, and highly developed R&D capabilities. Together with our existing advanced manufacturing expertise, it provides us with a platform for success. Our ambition is to succeed in the global space sector and develop core industries, including manufacturing, robotics, engineering, mining, and resources. We want to triple the size of our space economy to $12 billion and increase employment by 2030. There's a great deal to be excited about for the future of our space partnership with the United States. Earlier this year, Australian ministers announced the commencement of negotiations with the United States on a bilateral technology safeguards agreement to enable US companies use Australian launch sites once the agreement is finalised. And here in Southern California, there is a dynamic and growing space industry that's keen to invest and expand in Australia. I've had the pleasure of touring some of the facilities located around me and been impressed by the innovation that makes it possible for a satellite to be launched from a modified Boeing 747. I saw the James Webb Space Telescope before its launch, which was 20 years in the making and is 1,000 times more powerful than the Hubble telescope. The United States and Australia are long-term alliance partners, and we cooperate on so many levels. Our enduring friendship is a strategic asset that we can draw on in bringing our talented innovators, scientists, and entrepreneurs together in this final frontier. I'm looking forward to welcoming an Australian space delegation back to the United States for the Colorado Springs Space Symposium next year and for discussions on space at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. Thanks for your interest in joining the discussions today, which I'm looking forward to hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for setting the scene on the global space industry and shedding some light on Australia's place within it. I'm very excited to be hosting an audience that comes from around the world. This is what Advance is about. Thank you to those who submitted questions before this event, and thank you to all those who have completed our first poll. Now, you will have seen that poll posted when you logged in, and if you haven't, you've still got a few seconds now to complete it. and we will show the results shortly. We would love to learn more about our audience as we go along through the polls and through the chat on the right-hand side of the screen. But if you prefer to view the speakers on full screen, you can close or minimize the Slido interactive part of the screen at any time. We also have live captioning of this town hall to support accessibility. Today, we have an illustrious lineup of Australian experts in the space sector who are working overseas and at home in Australia. They'll take us on a journey through the many aspects of Australia's space economy. We will hear live presentations from 5 experts, followed by a video with 5 more experts on key issues. Now, you might have seen in the program that we were going to hear from Dr. Cassandra Steer, who has done a lot of work around space law. Unfortunately, she is unable to join us today. She is unwell, but we are particularly grateful to Professor Caroline McGregor for joining us at short notice. You will see her speak on the video compilation, and then she'll be joining us for the Q&A afterwards. When we have this panel discussion, we'll use your pre-submitted questions, and we'd love any further input through the Q&A and chat sections of Slido on the right of your screen. Now, let's have a look at where our audience is joining from today, and we'll just pull up the results of the Slido poll. Is that maybe a thumbs up? Fantastic. Great. And we'll now hear from Anthony Murfitt, the Deputy Head, Australian Space Agency, who will share what Australia has been doing to grow the space industry and what the future holds.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joanna. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land, on those in Australia on which we're meeting. I'm in Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. It is terribly exciting to be here to talk to you today about the excitement that we have here in the space industry here in Australia. We've got the likes of Adam, we've got Caroline, we've heard from Jane, and we've also got Chris with us, who has just recently been to space. And I reflected just before starting the conversation today that when Chris and I first caught up 4.5 years ago, these are the type of things that we were only dreaming about, and now we're not only just dreaming about them, we're actually doing them here, and Australia is doing them. And I'll take you a little bit on that journey. So I'll bring up my first slide, and what I want to start with is really just the purpose of the Space Agency, which is on the following slide. The Space Agency here in Australia is very much about growing and transforming a globally respected space industry that inspires and improves the lives of Australians. We heard from Jane earlier that said we have a very clear mission in that we have to triple the size of the sector to 12 billion by 2030 and create another 20,000 jobs. And why have we got that mandate, and what has been the driver behind that? And I think we've heard some of that story from Jane today. We've seen this massive transformation of space. So I'll go to my next slide. In space, we use space every single day. We use it to find our way to work. We use it for weather. And one of the unknown facts is that if we look at satellite data and we look at weather, it provides us a 4-day forecast versus a 1-day forecast. And what that means for our own safety and security is quite important, particularly when we're looking at climate events and monitoring climate and more extreme weather events. Not only are we doing that, we also heard from Jane around it draws on a really strong manufacturing base, and we'll hear from Adam later on today about some of the work that he's doing in developing rockets. But importantly, the reason Australia is really punching above its weight is that we have a range of adjacent industries. We have our mining sector, for example, that has had years and years of experience of working in harsh environments, using automation, and we're able to leverage that technology and now put it to space because space is a lot more accessible. And because space is more accessible, there are now new business models. So it's not the realm of governments alone anymore. It's no longer the 1960s, it's the 2020s. And the role of Space Agency is really shifting from being the predominant operator in space to being a partner and facilitator. And one of the real drivers for Australia and the Australian Space Agency is for the agency to really open those doors internationally, work with industry here and make sure that they can access these supply chains. But of course, I'm talking to people all around the world, and we want to highlight not only the great opportunities for space around the world, but you can actually do space right here. And I think as we look at those opportunities, we're using space every day. We've got this strong manufacturing base, and we've got a range of sectors where Australia already does well, whether it's medical technologies. These type of technologies are going to be needed in space when we return humans to have long-term presence in space. We've got our manufacturing base around robotics, and we'll have new areas such as quantum technologies and AI. These are all going to be needed for space because we use it every day, and we help those things such as understanding our land, understanding drought, and managing our crops. Next slide, please. And the next one as well. So when we started the Space Agency a couple of years ago, actually it's 3.5 years ago, what we wanted to be really clear is what is Australia's role in the world and why can we play a key part in what is going to be $1 trillion industry by 2040. One of the big things we did is we came out and said there are 7 priority areas where Australia can play a role. So the world knew that Australia was at the table and where it could participate. Now, these areas include Earth observations. So again, using satellite data to understand what's happening on the Earth so we can better understand and manage drought. We can help our farmers undertake their activities. We've got communication technologies. So Australia is known for beaming that image of Neil Armstrong around the world in the 1960s. When we go back to Mars, we're going to need faster communications. And one of the really exciting things is that Australia has great capabilities in quantum and optical technologies, which can be up to 40 times faster than what we're experiencing now, which means we can think about having real-time communications with the moon and on Mars, and Australia has that expertise that we can leverage. There are things such as position, navigation and timing. What we're doing here in Australia is getting the resolution of that GPS signal from what is often 10 metres, get it down to 10 centimetres or even 3 centimetres where we've got our cell or mobile phone here in Australia so that we can better support our way of life. And I give an example that imagine being able to have a 3 centimetre accuracy for GPS and what it would mean for people with that are visually impaired. It really becomes an enabler for much of our way of life. Some of the other exciting areas are space situational awareness. Again, Australia has a large continent in the southern hemisphere, and it's important that as we look to use space, we want long-term sustainability. And as part of that, we need to understand what is in orbit so that we can manage that environment. I've touched on briefly around robotics. I've outlined that we have a great resources and mining sector that has this array of technologies that we can apply and adapt into space. And I'll talk through one of our programs shortly. You got that little glimpse of what a moon rover and what that will mean for Australia. And I'll talk about that soon. And again, that draws on our resourcing sector. And I know I've got Adam on the line, so of course it'd be remiss if I didn't talk about access to space. We're very, very aware that if we want to play a role in space, we've got to get our technology to space. And so that's going to be an important area over the coming years as Australia looks to cement its place in the global space economy. And of course, what we're mindful of is that as we think about the next 10 and 20 years, we want to ensure Australia remains now ahead of the curve. We're doing the catch up, and what we're now doing is thinking about what are those leading edge technologies that we can invest in, draw in across multiple other sectors, AI, quantum, and how can we ensure that Australia's best ideas get into space. Next program, please. So I'll just touch briefly on the programs and what we're doing here in Australia to really catalyse and accelerate the growth of the space industry. And the signs are strong. We're growing at around 4%. It's growing above GDP. And I think that is fascinating. It's because of the likes of the businesses that we have here, but importantly, some of the investments that the Australian government has made over the last 3.5 years. So over the last 3.5 years, there's been an investment of over 700 million in the Australian space sector, which is really phenomenal. And we've also seen briefly in defence. Defence is also orientating. They're talking about investing billions of dollars into space capability, and importantly, they've developed and now announced a space sovereign industrial capability, which is really showing that the important role space will play. What the Australian Space Agency is doing is really focusing on 4 elements in our programs. Firstly, we want to open those doors internationally, and we've been doing that for 3.5 years. The world knows we're here. The world wants to engage with Australia. We've been around the table with all the heads of agencies, and what's been fascinating when talking to our counterparts is they know we're there, they want us involved, and they know we have the technology to be able to contribute to their missions. The other thing we're doing is building national capability. We know we have to run fast. So it's really important that we've got programs that are either investing in infrastructure, that are working with our businesses to understand where they've got capability gaps, and importantly, think about the global conditions to ensure that we can export our technologies. And we heard around things such as a technology safeguard agreement. Importantly, we're a regulator as well, but we want to have competitive regulations, and we know that can be a real strength for Australia, and we're progressing a range of things in that area. And the last thing we also focus on in our programs is inspiring. What we really want to achieve is to inspire the kids to get into space. We want to show them that they don't have to go overseas for space anymore. They can be right here in Australia. They can build rockets. They can build those satellites, and we'll hear from many speakers today about those opportunities. So very briefly on the programs, we've invested things like mission control, where companies can now control their space assets here in Australia. We're investing in the Moon to Mars program. We're working with NASA, and a couple of weeks ago, we are now going to place a Aussie rover on the surface of the moon, working with NASA. And the reason we can do that is because we've identified a core capability we have, which is being able to move regolith and show that we can extract, give it to NASA so it can extract oxygen, which is needed to support long-term sustainability on the surface of the moon. But the fact that we can have great capability in automation of assets afar is really, really important. Again, we're investing in a range of international activities, from new forms of spacesuits and into things such as AI to support astronauts on long journeys. Now, this is important too, because we want to think about the return back to the Australian public. Those technologies such as AI, we've got many people in rural communities, and the more that we can show our investments in space help our way of life here on Earth become absolutely paramount. We've got another range of frameworks that we have internationally, including with the UK. But I know I'm running out of time. We've got a range of other speakers that want to get on and talk about all the great things we're there. So just going forward, and as we think through things, we've got an Australian civil space strategy. We're going into phase 3. It's very much thinking about how can we be big and bold? How can we catalyse the industry behind us so that they can get a greater hold of that 1 trillion sector that will be that size by 2040. And excitedly, what we want is the kids to be able to look up to that sky and say, there's Australian technology up there, and I can now build space assets here in Australia. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. In just over 3 years since its establishment, it's exciting to hear about all the foundational investment that the Australian government has put in place through the Australian Space Agency. And already we're seeing some of the questions come through regarding what that means for other industries and how we can see the flow-on effects. And I think we'll certainly cover that. We know that from the results of our poll, and you can see the results of the poll if you are in the Slido app, but I'll just share with you in terms of the location of our audience today, certainly a global audience with Brazil, Germany, South Africa. Hello from wherever you're dialing in from and registered from today. And it's fantastic to have you with us, as well as a large Australian audience. I think it's also important to note that of the people joining today, the audience, we do have about 15% from within the space industry, but there's really a lot of aficionados, armchair learners, we know that space is an incredibly compelling area and something that people have a lot of interest in and want to know how it affects us. And so it's not surprising that 60% of the audience responded have some knowledge and always learning, and 7% have said they had extensive knowledge. So really a great mix there, but also really apt for our speakers today who are giving us such a rich introduction to some of the issues at hand. We will now hear from Dr. Chris Bosshausen. Now, Chris is a tireless advocate for space exploration. He explains it to anyone, any field, anywhere in all the language that makes sense. And he's an advanced board member and an incredibly Australia's most recent astronaut who journeyed into space last month with Blue Origin. Chris will be discussing developments in the US and what he is seeing as an investor in new technologies. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Johanna. Thanks for that great introduction. So I've been, I was fortunate enough to win one of the Advance Awards back in 2014 for some of the work I did at a company called Planet Labs, and subsequently joined the board of Advance in 2015. And one of Advance's missions is to bring the value of expatriate Australians back home to Australia. And so I thought it only fair that I share some of the experiences that I've had in the US and how I was there at ground zero of the sort of beginning of the commercial nano satellite revolution. So if we can just pull up my slides, I have a presentation of mostly beautiful pictures for us to look at. But starting off with, on the next slide, a slightly ugly picture. Here is my soon-to-be, at that time, co-founder of Planet Labs, Will Marshall, and I holding a fairly ugly-looking concept satellite, which was an attempt. My first job in the US was at NASA, when NASA has 10 centers around the US, and I moved here in 2008 to the US. And so Will and I were trying to figure out why spacecraft at the time was so expensive, often behind schedule by years, and with massive cost overruns. And so this was our first thought experiment in an ultra low-cost satellite. And one of the most remarkable things about this satellite was it really didn't do much. It was really just a demonstrator of all of the key concepts and cost about $500. But we took it to a conference, and I remember a gentleman came up to me and said to me that we were lying and that there was no way that this could possibly lead to anything valuable in space. So I want to spend the rest of my presentation telling you how wrong that particular gentleman was and how proud I am of this photo. So next slide. So one of the things that we did, so NASA Ames and the NASA Ames Research Center is right next to Google in Northern California. And at Google, they were developing at this time the Android phone. And this is one of the early prototypes of the Motorola Droid phone, if any of you remember that. And I remember a bunch of Google folks brought us some phones, and we put some of them in a vacuum chamber to see if they could actually work in space. And to our great surprise, this is a phone running in the vacuum of space inside a vacuum chamber, and it's still running. So that gave us a crazy idea that what if we could put a phone in space for real? So on the next slide, we have attached to a high altitude balloon at about 30 kilometers altitude is this thing that we invented called PhoneSat. And so PhoneSat, we used a CubeSat box. This is about 10 by 10 by 10 centimeters. And we jammed a phone in there with some extra batteries, initially launching it on a balloon and then later into orbit as a free-flying satellite. And so this was a $3,000 US satellite that at that time had the fastest computer, I think, of any satellite in orbit. More storage, more storage space, more memory, faster CPU. It could run apps. We wrote an app to take a photo of the Earth. This camera, it had an 8-megapixel camera built in. At that time, the Mars Curiosity rover had a 2-megapixel camera. And so by jumping onto technologies developed outside the space industry, we were able to leapfrog decades of slow progress at NASA and actually fly, at that time, the cheapest and the most powerful satellite that had ever been launched. It's pretty amazing to think that this is just a phone flying in space. On the next slide, we have a picture taken by the app. This is one of the ones, I guess we didn't do a great job on our AI algorithm about picking the best pictures, but this is a photo of Earth that was chopped up into chunks and sent back via the ham radio network and picked up in little chunks by operators all around the world. So we had about 40 or 50 ham radio enthusiasts that helped us retrieve this image and send back the pieces to us, which we reassembled into a photo. So this is a photo taken from space by a phone. And probably if I have even just one important thing in my presentation, it would be this. Everyone in this audience has in their back pocket more space capability than the Soviet Union had when they launched Sputnik in 1957. And so for frankly not much money, you could build your own spacecraft and put it in space. And so if Australia wants to really get involved, I think starting with universities and student groups and so on, and actually just dipping the toe in the water of getting into space, it's cheaper and easier than you can imagine. So anyway, having launched a phone into space, we as they say in NASA, we drank our own Kool-Aid, and we thought, what do we do next? And so we thought if we could launch hundreds of low-cost satellites, we could map the whole world every day. So jumping onto the next slide. As you do in Silicon Valley, we started a company in a garage, actually only about 1 kilometer or 2 down the road from where Apple was founded in Cupertino. And this is one of our engineers from NASA who joined us, Ben Howard, and working on a prototype for what became the Planet Labs Dove satellite, which is essentially the direct ancestor of PhoneSat. Instead of using a phone, we used a regular computer and a whole bunch of off-the-shelf components. And for about the price of a Honda Civic, I like to say, we could launch a high-capability Earth imaging satellite that was, again, more capable and significantly cheaper than anything had been launched before. On the next slide, I think we have some pictures of that. So this is one of my favorite pics. We initially were launching.
You'll have to turn off aeroplane mode.
We have, sorry, my Google phone just decided to answer me because I mentioned Google. So this is when you're launching from the space station, the astronauts can take these really cool photos out of the window. And this is a photo of 2 of our satellites popping out into orbit. And this photo is the correct way up. I think that's the way it was taken. And Earth up above, but 2 of these satellites are actual real Earth imaging satellites that we developed and launched. And so on the next slide, I have a couple of pictures of the results. So this first one is the Great Barrier Reef. This is taken in 2018, and this is around the area of Heron Island. The company Planet Labs had announced about 2 years ago a partnership with the Paul Allen Foundation to map every coral reef in the world every day so that we can track changes to our valuable coral assets all around the planet. It's one of my favorite uses of our data from space. On the next slide, we have actual fires in Cape Barren. These were fires in Western Australia in 2016. And so one of the cool things about fire from space is that the smoke leaves a beautiful vector pointing straight to the source of the fire. And particularly in a country like Australia, there are many fires that go unnoticed. It's not true in the United States where the population density and distribution is so high. In Australia, these kinds of things can often go unnoticed. And so space plays a valuable role in identifying fires and other natural disasters. Speaking of natural disasters, on the next slide, I have 2 paired slides if the audio folks want to jump between this and the next slide as well. Go back and forth if you like. But this is the Hawkesbury River in March 23 of this year. And as many of you know, there was catastrophic large-scale flooding there. Here's the difference the week before and the week of the flood. And so at peak, this is 13 meters of water here, 13 meters deep in this flooded region, observed from space. And so again, in all parts of the world, and particularly in developing regions in the tropics, Planet Labs plays a vital role in identifying events as they happen on our planet. And then another one, just on the next 2 slides as well, we have 2 quite remarkable images. This is the what they call the expansion airport, the airline storage airport, and an expansion that was put in. This is in Alice Springs, and this is where they store aircraft that are not being used. And during the pandemic, you can see on this slide and the next slide, the number of stored aircraft that were placed here. In fact, they had to add extra taxiways and storage for the almost 50 or 60 new planes that were added. And events like this happen all around the world that have tremendous economic value and impact on how we live our life and can be indicative of events happening that we can understand and use in predictions and modeling and forecasting to allow us to make better economic, environmental, and social choices. So these are just some of the things that Planet has been able to accomplish. If we jump on to the next slide, I've now joined a venture fund where I've been taking the formula of my lessons from NASA and Planet and applying that to new companies. So at Data Collective Venture Capital, we've done a number of investments in space. A very notable one is our friends across in New Zealand, Rocket Lab, another launch company. They have recently joined the NASDAQ stock market here in the US, but this was the first investment I made when I joined DCVC about 5 years ago. We have Capella Space, which is doing the radar version of Planet. So imagine being able to see through cloud and to take images at night as well. It's a very powerful capability. I know Anthony mentioned GPS refinement. So we have a company called TrustPoint GPS that is helping refine and improve GPS accuracy with a fleet of low-flying satellites. And Reach Labs is a company doing beam power transmission, which is really valuable in natural disasters where you need to very quickly get up new power when the power lines have gone down, as well as a number of companies doing computational work and analytics for material science and environmental engineering. And just jumping to the last slide of my talk here, when we first put together that model satellite, we had a dream back in 2008 that wouldn't it be nice if one of the outcomes of our work was that 100 space companies around the world got formed over the next decade. It kind of reminds me of that saying that as humans, we tend to overestimate short-term progress and underestimate long-term progress. So I think by now there's probably at least 200 companies doing just launch and over 1,000 satellite companies around the world that are doing low-cost spacecraft because of the revolution that we've seen in the last decade in access to space. And so I think the industry, when I first left Australia to do some of this work, I think the entire global small satellite industry was about the size of what it is in Australia now. So it's pretty amazing to think what can happen over the next 10 years as Australia continues to develop its own capability and take part in this boom of tremendous activity that's happening around the world. And with that, I will wrap.
Thank you so much, Chris. I have received a number of text messages while you have been talking, asking me to ask you to tell us about your adventure last month. So I promise we will certainly get to that as part of the panel discussion. It sounds like there's a lot of interest in that particular aspect of your journey, but what we can really see there is the practical uses from that enormous investment and time and skills that you have put into this field, and incredible. We have a team member who was in the Hawkesbury at the time of the flooding, and that was just such an incredible visual reflection of what she was going through. We know none of this. Space travel, space exploration, space utilization would be possible without the hardware to launch objects into space. We will now hear from Adam Gilmore, founder and CEO of Gilmore Space Technologies, sharing his insight into the innovative developments by entrepreneurs in the space sector. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Joanna. So if I go to my first slide, this is a picture of us signing an agreement with the Space Agency a couple of years ago. And there's Anthony there and Karen Andrews behind, who's been a massive supporter of space and still is, and that's fantastic. I think it was a good agreement to sign back then because it demonstrated what we were looking to do into the future. And it was a good foundational document for further work that we can do with the Space Agency. In terms of what I think is needed in the next 2 years, and I've had extensive discussions with people in all forms of the government, are contracts that Australian companies can work on. If you look at the technology readiness level of quite a few different Australian companies, they're now at a stage where they can start competing and building for business from the Australian government. It's our estimate that there's probably anywhere up to $500 million a year that's spent annually on space data from the Australian government, and probably another $500 million that has to be spent annually in the future as the government gets more capability from space. So what we'd really love to see is a 5 to 10 year contract of satellites and launches from Australia. And I've heard that the government's working on this, and I think it is exactly what we have to do. And I'm looking forward to hearing some announcements before the next election. We'll go to the next slide. We've got 108 people working in the company now. It's probably double where we were a year ago, and we'll probably double that again by the end of next year. The core technology that we work on is hybrid rocket engines, which is a solid fuel and a liquid oxidizer. That's something we've been working on for the last pretty much 7 years now, and we think we're one of the world leaders, if not the world leader in this technology. Hybrid rockets power the main engines that we have, and also the second stage. This is a picture actually of the rocket going up at our launch site, which is in Abbott Point, which is an area that's managed by the Juru people. And we've leased the land up there, and we've got a cultural heritage agreement with the Juru. And I was very happy to see that that was literally done in 7 days. It was, we think, the fastest cultural heritage agreement ever done in Australia, but I can't verify that. If I go to the next slide, that's talking about the role of venture capital. And venture capital is supremely important in space. We're venture capital backed. Pretty much all of the companies in Australia that are pushing the technology forward are venture capital backed. If I compare venture capital in Australia to, say, the United States, on average, the valuations of Australian companies are about 1/3 to 1/5 of what our peers are in the US. And the money that's raised in Australia is about 1/3 to 1/5 of what's raised in the US, which does put us at a disadvantage. There's only about 2 venture capital companies that are regularly investing in space in Australia, and that's Blackbird and Main Sequence. So I'd love to see more venture capital get involved. I'm happy to see that superannuation funds have started to invest in space. So in our last round, 3 different super funds invested, and they've been investing in other space companies. I think that's fantastic. What the lower amounts of raises have done in Australia is make Australian space companies very good at using capital. We're very conservative with capital, and we move technology forward, spending vastly less money than our global peers. And I think that's going to be a big differentiator in the future. It's very easy to raise $1 billion and build a rocket. It's not so easy when you've only got $100 million to build a rocket. If I go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the dual use of space, specifically launch vehicles and satellites. A lot of the technologies in space that you can use for civilian activities, you can also use for defensive activities. A lot of the images that Chris was talking about before are examples of things that defence uses as well, with bigger and better cameras. Communications is supremely important for defence, and understanding what our adversaries are doing is very important. If I look at where we are in the defence industry in Australia for space, we're still waiting on the Defence Department to kind of come up with a roadmap. The good news is they're working on a roadmap. We think in the next 2 or 3 months, they'll announce the roadmap. Some of the critical enablers are already there. They've announced that there's a Space Force now with a really, really good leader in charge of that I know well. Space is a sovereign industry capability priority now, which is fantastic. And I can't wait to see what that enables in terms of technology spending from the Defence Force. And the other thing that's just came out is the government has said launch vehicles and small satellites are one of the 61 critical technologies. So I think there's definitely an awareness from the government and an awareness of defence that space is super important for Australia's future. What we're really looking forward to, and I know Anthony's working very hard on this, is a roadmap of what that looks like in terms of what are the technologies we want to see and how are we going to fund their development. I think if we can do that, that'll be really, really important. If I go to the last slide, this is just a feel-good shot when Enrico, the space agency, had visited the company. I think at the time we had about 70 employees. That was about 6 months ago now. And it just was great to have him at the factory and to see what we were doing. And I think it's a good example of, with the focus and the effort of some of the best entrepreneurs we have in the country, we will become a space power in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam. And it is remarkable what you have achieved in such a short period of time. And when I hear you speak and the clarity with which you express what you need from government, what you need from VCs, what you need in the way of collaboration, I'm not surprised at all. I recently saw some case studies released by the Global Talent and Business Attraction Task Force showing incredible internationally trained engineers that you have brought to Australia on the Global Talent Visa. And if we ever wanted proof of the economic and skills dividend from new entrepreneurs in the space industry and the people that you employ, you've provided it with Gilmore Space Technologies. And so at this point, it's really important to acknowledge the amazing work that CSIRO, Cicada Innovations and Microsoft are all doing, and there's many others who are doing in the area to facilitate the growth of Australian startups to fuel this pipeline of innovation. And to elaborate on the major players and to discuss the levels of cooperation between different sectors, we will now hear from Phil Ridley, CEO of QuasarSat. Thanks so much, Phil.
Thank you. I just wanted to acknowledge our Aboriginal place name is Wallametta, and that's where the suburb of Marsfield is located. And I just wanted to acknowledge the ownership and leadership of the traditional owners, past, present and future. So when we talk about space, we tend to look to the sky, but a critical component of space technology is actually on the ground. In order to talk to satellites in orbit and rockets, like Adam's companies and others, objects in the sky, you need ground stations in the right capacity in the right locations to be able to uplink and downlink data. So this network of ground stations essentially forms an information highway between Earth and space. Today, the ground station industry traditionally relies on hundreds of parabolic dishes that move and track satellites. They can only talk to one satellite at a time. So they repoint themselves. It's called slewing. So they move from one satellite to another. They tend to be expensive and slow, and sometimes they can't keep up. In fact, we believe that ground communication costs for the cost of the satellite will end up being more than the cost of the satellite itself. So it sort of costs more to operate it than launch it. And so we want to change this. And so Quasar is a ground station capability, and we're delivering what we call space data as a service. And so we hope that our technology will radically change the way the SATCOMs is done. A little bit about us. So again, we're another venture capital-backed company developing a sovereign ground station solution, designed, built and operated here in Australia. And it's based on a new technology, pure electronic beam steered phased array. They're capable of talking to multiple objects at once. So instead of talking to one satellite, hopefully we can talk to hundreds of satellites simultaneously because they have no moving parts. They also have a lot more capacity than traditional dishes. So what we will be demonstrating soon is one antenna will talk to, for example, a geosynchronous satellite, as well as two fast-moving LEO satellites moving different directions all at the same time. Because of this capability and because they have hundreds of beams, it's also useful for scanning a lot of the sky at the same time very quickly and accurately. And of course, this is like a lot of the space things we've talked about today. It's a dual-use item, very handy for safeguarding national security interests and making sure our assets in the sky are operating safely and the essential functions they perform for society still work. There are other technologies out there that we're working with as well, like optical and radar. So we see ourselves as part of that ecosystem to help keep space safe, as well as offer just pure satellite communications. So we offer a range of services, as it sort of shows up there in the top right. One thing we can do with our phased arrays, we can operate new kind of business models like premium models, where we can offer dedicated beams to customers so that we don't miss satellite passes anymore. And again, we can contribute to space domain awareness. And there's been a good example this week of a satellite being deliberately destroyed. And of course, that sort of thing, we would like to contribute to that not happening and know when it does happen. So growth in space is really exploding. So, in the entire history of humankind, we've launched maybe 3,000 satellites. By the end of this decade, we'll be launching 20 times the number of those satellites to over 57,000 of them. that's just massive growth. And what we see is that the ground infrastructure may not keep up with that. We do know, talking to a lot of players in the industry, there's a lot of data bottlenecks, and some of the business, sort of the unsustainable cost models are starting to come through now, because it takes a lot to build enough dishes to talk to them. So phased arrays are seen as the industry answer to the problem, and this is what we're focusing on. So in order to harness the power of a phased array, they also need a scalable digital processing infrastructure matched to it. And our design is pure digital, so there's no coax cables or anything like that. And because it's pure digital, because it's software driven, we can scale with software rather than having lots more radio dishes out there. It's a far better and more scalable business model. I guess for us, it's a very large business opportunity. The number of new satellites being launched, particularly the new the satellite clusters and the new constellations that are going up. The other thing that's interesting is, apart from the number of objects going up there, is obviously the volume of traffic per satellite is going up. And that's related to the frequency band that they use, but also to the business models that are being used, for example, the internet. And so we see more objects out there, we see far more speed up there. And so really the only technology we believe that can handle this challenge, apart from optical, for certain cases, is multi-beam phased array technology. And so we are leading, we believe, the world in this technology. We have some technology developed by CSIRO, originally from radio astronomy, that has some very unusual and amazing characteristics we intend to deploy with our system. So that's really us. If you're interested in knowing any more, please, to collaborate or investment or whatever, please get in touch with us at quasisat.com. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil, for showing how Quasisat is really changing the way satellite communications is done. And we can see the flow-on benefits and that development of the next phase of the industry with what you're doing there. Now, we're loading another poll for you and to reflect on the comments of our incredible speakers so far. And so you can check that out on Slido if you're logged in there. But every year, Advance holds the Advance Awards to recognise the achievements of Australians and international graduates of Australian universities. And as the nominations come in each year, we consistently have a disproportion of nominees who are working in space-related fields. It could be its own category. We end up spreading them across a number of different categories: entrepreneurship, sometimes life sciences, sometimes advanced manufacturing, as we've seen, and you'll note that a number of our speakers today are former Advance Award winners. But it's no wonder that we have a large number of perspectives to draw on today, both of those former award winners, but also people that they have suggested we hear from as well. And with that, we asked for a number of other leaders and emerging leaders in the field and some of the decision makers shaping the field in Australia to share what they are doing. And so with that, I will cue the video, please, of our incredible 5 speakers that will share their perspective.
The South Australian Government has a clear vision to grow our space economy. This vision sees local businesses capitalising on the exciting opportunities that come from new space, where we've seen a 64% annual growth rate since 2016. Our thriving space community is already delivering across the entire space value chain. Home to the Australian Space Agency, Space Discovery Centre and Mission Control, the Bureau of Meteorology's Space Weather Services and several space-related defence facilities, South Australia is at the heart of Australia's space endeavours. The SmartSat CRC sees the creation of new technologies to build new space capabilities, with a locally manufactured small satellite being launched into low Earth orbit, providing the opportunity to prove some of these technologies and support new applications. Our Space Innovation Fund is supporting space startups to attract investment and bring new space products and services to market. And we can literally launch them into space with licensed suborbital and orbital launch facilities. We are inspiring our young people to join the exciting future that the space economy brings. We are committed to creating a collaborative, globally competitive and sustainable space industry, ensuring South Australia continues to take full advantage of one of the 21st century's transformative industries.
My name's Professor Carolyn McGregor, and I'm an Australian who's lived in Canada for more than a decade. Currently, I'm the founding director and research chair of the Joint Research Centre in Artificial Intelligence for Health and Wellness between Ontario Tech University and the University of Technology in Sydney. Our focus is creating new computing platforms for health, wellness, resilience, and adaptation in extreme settings. And in space, my focus is on creating new approaches for autonomous health monitoring for astronauts, private astronauts, and space tourists as well. I'm leading a research study on the International Space Station with the operational name of Space Health, where we're measuring the physiology of astronauts while they live and work in space, and also testing my new autonomous health monitoring solution. In addition, I'm working with Comstar Communications, who will be deploying the first optical and radio frequency satellite. It'll be within 41,000 miles of the moon, and it will enable new forms of space data management to support, amongst other things, space health monitoring through my new space data analytics as a service. And it will enable both autonomous health monitoring in space, but also the ability to send the data down to Earth in a more realistic time frame than has previously been available with radio frequency satellites. In Australia, we have enormous potential to be a leader in the space sector in a number of niche areas. In my view, we have great potential in the area of health monitoring and also in telecommunications. And we can do this by fostering an environment of imagination, innovation, and application.
Hi, I'm Vienna Tran, and I'm a space medicine researcher. Next year, I'll be a doctor working in regional South Australia. My field of research is in muscle health. Specifically, how do we mitigate the muscle losses that astronauts experience in microgravity in space? I think this is really important research because it will not only help astronauts stay healthy and strong and functional on Mars and on Earth, but also help people back on Earth who have hip disorders, who are sedentary or are elderly. I think it's really important for us to recognise the translational benefits that space research has for Earth. And I think this is especially true in space medicine. So I would really like to see more and more research being done in this field so that Australia can contribute to the world stage when it comes to keeping people healthy in space. And Australia's really good at that. Look at the Royal Flying Doctor Service and how we do telehealth and remote medicine. I also think it's important to have opportunities for training and upskilling for young people and grown-ups alike so that we can all be part of the space arena.
Hi, I'm Andrea Boyd. I work at Mission Control for the International Space Station. We run hundreds of different research activities with a multinational crew across 4 connected orbiting laboratories to benefit humanity back on Earth. Australia's key considerations in this ever-growing space industry are those mentioned by my fellow speakers, and also building back trust by following through on international partnerships so that the Australian industry can advance and be considered seriously for more advanced partnerships and the export markets.
Hi, my name is Annie Handmer. I'm a researcher in Science and Technology Studies at the University of Sydney, and I'm also the host and creator of the Space Junk podcast. In my research, I look at the effects of structural policy and funding arrangements on scientific research and technological development. I conduct empirical study of how space science is done in the real world. And in particular, I'm interested in the way that structural forces play out at that person-to-person level, at the nexus between academia, the private sector, and government. I think that the biggest challenge we're going to face in the space sector as a nation is reconciling our legal obligations with our strategic interests and our commercial ambitions. We need to ensure that in achieving one goal, we're not undermining another. So in the case of dual-use technology, for example, I believe the solution is not going to come from further technological development, but instead from informed whole-of-government policy and funding reform. And I think it's really vital for our continued use of space for civil and humanitarian matters in particular, that we all agree where we're headed and how we want to get there. Thank you.
Wow, what an incredible array of different points that our speakers there have raised as well. So to put all that into the mix, we are going to kick off a panel discussion and with our incredible speakers, and joined also by Carolyn McGregor, who you saw on the video. And I guess with that, thank you. We will kick off with a question for Anthony Burford. With everything that you've been doing in the Australian Space Agency, and I know that you've got such a deep history with the public service, what do you say to those who are cynical about the amount of expenditure on space exploration and you know the common refrain about there's so much to fix on our own planet? How do you justify the investment, and to what extent are you approached by that sort of cynical comment from the public and other critics of the space investment?
Yeah, no, thank you, Joanna, for that question. And I think I'd start with, I don't think it's a cynical comment. I think it's a fair comment for any expenditure that we undertake. But I think what we did from day zero is really get on the front foot and explain how important space was to every part of our life. We heard from Chris, he's developed these new satellites, which really was part of the transformation of the space sector, and that we can use that data to help our way of life. So what we did very early on is make sure we could translate our investments in space and how it helps people here on Earth. And whether it's explaining that these new form of technologies are cheaper and it can help farmers better manage their land. And so one of the examples is there's a company, either it's Fleet or Myriota, they're combining Internet of Things with these small satellites. And in some cases, it means that farmers can now check their water on their property from their couch, rather than having to drive around every single dam to work out which one is low or they need to fix. And though the efficiency gain is quite profound, the other story we tell is that we've already got a lot of technologies that we can apply in space. So we're not starting from ground zero, and the world wants us to contribute. And this is this sector that's going to transform our way of life in the future. And it really is an important part of our safety and security. Like just getting weather data, for example, becomes really, really paramount. But I think, again, even our funding programs, where, yes, we're putting a rover on the moon, but that automation technology is going to improve automation technology here on Earth. If we heard about space medicine, the more we learn from space medicine, we can improve the way we adopt medicine here on Earth. And even if we look at Adam's technologies around rockets, it means these are new materials that are being developed that can go into other sectors and improve those sectors as well. So I think, we really sort of just reinforce that, yes, there are a lot of challenges the world is facing. We know we're facing these in light of COVID. Space is one part of those story which can really help our way of life here on Earth. And I always leave it the beautiful thing about space. And we heard Chris, he's been to space. Everyone wants to hear about that experience. It inspires. And I think at this point in time, we really need to engage with the community. They need a good news story. We need to show what we can do. And Australia can be now part of this journey, and we can encourage the kids, and we've got to talk to the parents about why this is very real and tangible. So I think they're just some of the ways we do it. And we're always mindful that every time we look to invest in space, how can we translate it back? My dad's an electrician, so I've got to be able to explain to my dad, why are we investing in space and why are we doing this? And excitedly, in the future, everything is going to be space related. So Australia's got to be there at the table with some of the great people we have around this call today.
Thanks, Anthony. And they are some fantastic examples of the practical uses and the flow-on benefits from this space investment. But you're right, everyone wants to be inspired. Chris, we're dying to know, what was it like to be Australia's first space traveller last month and to travel into space with Will Shatner? Tell us all about it.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate to be one of only 3 Australians that have ever gone to space, and I think it's pretty cool that I was able to go up as a pure Australian, as I like to say, and I didn't have to get American citizenship, which is a real sign that the world is changing and opening up. But yeah, it's as a space industry person, I was really, really worried that I would be desensitized to it. I've seen astronauts speak. I've seen photos of space. I've hoovered up every movie I could imagine. So I was worried I knew too much and I'd get up and go, it's okay. But in fact, it was more like wonderful and brilliant and beautiful than I could ever imagine. And it's actually, I struggled to find the words because it was just so captivating that I came down and I was like, I just need to go back up again right away. And I still do. So I want to go deeper and further into space because it was just so amazing to just be there.
You mentioned some of the training that you went through as in preparation for it, and remembering that you have been on this complete journey of wanting to go through flight school and having done a lot of other things in the meantime. Tell us about that training and what were some of the contingencies they prepared you for?
Well, if you're going on a suborbital flight like I did, you're not going to, say, get appendicitis or have a health emergency really in the middle of the flight because it's pretty short. So the training isn't too bad, but it's mostly about safety. And one of the most important things is when you're in zero gravity, you have to get back in your seat. And it turns out when you can't just fall and let your bum fall into the chair, which you would do on the ground, under gravity, it's actually quite hard. And you don't want to be still floating around when you hit the atmosphere because the capsule pulls about 5.5 Gs then. So we trained getting to our seat, and I remember going to sleep, practicing the moves, and they have like a 5-point racing harness. So it'd be like shoulder strap, waist strap, other shoulder strap, and memorizing that and sleeping on it for about 3 days. And I think we did that probably full simulations of the space flight in a capsule simulator they have. We probably practiced the whole thing about 20 times. Which took hours and hours and hours so that we could actually very safely get back into our seats and get back to the ground safely. But mostly it's just about the view. I mean, that's the one thing you can't get anywhere else on Earth, and fewer than 600 people have seen this view. And so part of the training is just how to make use of your time up there and how to be in zero gravity and how to look out of the window and what to look for. And it was a wonderful experience.
Thanks, Chris. And just turning to Phil for a moment, you mentioned the important bottlenecks that come with the exponential growth of the space industry. And you also mentioned the security issues that come with this growth. Can you tell me what threats you're asked or what sort of things you're asked to consider in your work? And we know that in the popular dialogue, there's a lot of comments about security, but what are the key considerations that you're asked to take into account?
Okay, that's a great question, actually, Joanna. So I guess there's a range of things as space gets more crowded that we all have to think about, and not just man-made things. Space junk, for example, is another one. So I think because we're moving a lot of our processing into space, it'll be similar to the internet in some ways. So it needs to be safe and it needs to be reliable and redundant and all of those sort of great things so that it always works, especially as we rely on it more. But because it's a physical network up there, then there's physical things that can happen too. So, satellites aren't always exactly where they're supposed to be, and they may accidentally interfere with another one, or of course somebody may want to interfere with your satellite. And so there's a range of things. So there's the physical side, but I think because it's getting more, there's so much infrastructure up there now that it's really is just making sure that it operates very, very well, like a really efficient highway. So the way we think of it is, how can we ensure that the way satellites talk to each other, it continues? How can we make sure that nothing can impede that, whether that's something that shouldn't be there or whether something doesn't operate well? So it's really inward looking and outward looking at the same time, but also being a good space citizen. That's quite broad, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like there's a topic in itself on that alone. And I know Annie Hanma also mentioned about space junk and the concerns around that. I'd love to ask the next question of Carolyn, and you spoke about niche markets of health monitoring, and not so niche because obviously we're seeing a lot of health monitoring, but the telecommunications associated with that. we'd love to hear more, but I'd also like to add in a second part to this question, and this comes from the chat. Could you comment on diversity from what you're seeing on a diversity front, including the female presence in the space industry, in research, the public sector, and particularly working between North America and Australia, what you're seeing on the diversity front?
Definitely some great questions. So first of all, around the communications, as for Australia, we have enormous potential to really support telecommunications, not just from low Earth orbit, but from the moon, from Mars, and have it to be the receiver from the communications coming down, and particularly with these new optical options for telecommunications. So we have enormous potential really to consider that strategically, about how we can really play our part in that ground station receiving infrastructure. Now, and then your other question around diversity, it's being addressed on a number of different fronts. So there are initiatives right from grassroots about welcoming people from different cultures and different genders to consider how they can contribute into space. In my own research, we know that physiology is fundamentally different between biological males and females. Resting heart rates are different fundamentally. And we're also now looking at patterns with the work I do with firefighters, tactical officers, and also now looking at in the astronaut cohort. We know that the behaviour of stress is different, but we don't understand yet whether it's biological or if there are other factors involved. One other thing that I'm involved in, to speak to the diversity aspect, is that I'm involved in European Space Agency study that's running right now. I'm leading one of 7 teams internationally for this study, and it's a dry immersion study. So they immerse people in these fluid tanks. They're protected from the water, but it simulates being in space. And there's 20 females that are being enrolled in that study. It's the first time it's been a study of that size for all females. And I've previously been analysing data from an all-male population that ran at the Russian Institute for Biomedical Problems. So whether it be analogue missions, those who take part in performing the analysis for those who contribute to all the different componentry that's being made for space, when we consider our study design, there's many, many ways we're considering diversity. It's a great question.
Thanks, Carolyn, and really goes to show the depths of partnerships and as you talk about the different research partners that you're working with, and it was certainly something that Andrea Boyd commented on in the video around how do we follow through on our partnerships and be a good partner. I would love to open that question up for the panel, talking about the different opportunities that we have and whether there's something underlying Andrea's comment there about being a good partner and how we go about that. Maybe Chris or Anthony, if there's any comments on that, that would be fantastic.
Anthony, what are your thoughts?
Nice handball. Thanks, Chris. So I think partnerships are fundamental in the space sector, and I think it's one. If we look at the Australian civil space strategy, it's the partnerships, collaborations are a key part of what we're doing. It's why we had a focus on the international initially, just to open those doors, show what Australia could do. Being a good partner is also important. If we look at the purpose of the Australian Space Agency, we've underpinned the words responsible, and this links back to the work we're doing in the UN and through the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And that what we want to do with space is ensure, as we democratise spaces, Chris rightly put, we want to ensure that our values here on Earth are reflected in space. And the Australia, through the Australian Space Agency and with our industry, is right behind that to ensure that those values are espoused. And I think as we go forward and we look forward to the moon and onto Mars, it's why Australia is one of the first signatories of the Artemis Accords, because we know how important it is that when we go to work on the moon and in space, we know what those rules are, and that gives certainty to our businesses as well. And I think that's the important part. And then lastly, just to close off on these partnerships, it's why the agency, as I said, has opened those doors. We've got MOU arrangements with over 10 international partners. And this partnership model is really important. Turning to our region here in the Indo-Pacific, space has become one of the core topics in the Quad between India, US, Australia and Japan. It'll form a part of AUKUS as well. And I think as we see that this partnership model is really, really important as we bring everyone together. And importantly, then by us doing that, it enables our industry, because again, that's the important element of these partnerships, in that we become trusted. We were trusted to send that signal of Neil Armstrong around the world. We were trusted with Japan when they had Hayabusa 2 come back into Woomera last year. And as we go forward, the world knows they can trust Australia in space, and the Australian Space Agency really advocate those values.
That's an incredible overview of some of the partnerships that are underway and what they mean for Australia. And just for the audience to let you know that we will have in our write-up of today's event, we'll include links to a lot of these partnerships that Anthony's just mentioned, but also some of the other key things that other speakers have mentioned, because we think it's a really important opportunity to spread the word about some of the more details behind the space industry. So we've got a couple of questions for Adam here, and really looking at beyond VC and research funding, there must be a business case behind most small space companies. And how will the future Australian space industry be profitable and prevent the ideas and people being swept up by multinationals such as Raytheon, Boeing, as well as other countries freely using our IP? I'm sure, Adam, you've been approached once or twice as an acquisition target, but are companies actively investing in IP portfolios through patents? And can you give some examples and maybe just what your experience is around this sort of surviving and thriving as a startup in Australia and as a small space company?
Sure. I mean, you asked me a few questions. I'll answer the first one. You obviously have to have a good business case to get venture capital. For example, all of our investors, when they invested in us, we didn't say we were going to plan to make any money out of defence or the space agency in our cash flow models. It was all very much commercial, and we think there is a massive commercial opportunity. We've already talked on the call about tens of thousands of satellites getting launched into space. They don't go into space and stay there forever. They have the shelf life and they need to be replaced. And that is a massive market. Rocket Lab is looking at that. Chris would know all about that, and we certainly are. We see that as a sustainable business. In terms of patents, we actually follow, Elon Musk's SpaceX policy on not patenting anything. One of the tricky things about, space activities is you don't get to see what your competitor does, and they don't get to see your technology. It's really easy for Samsung and Apple to fight each other over their tech because they can buy each other's phones. But, I don't get access to, Rocket Lab's rocket. They don't get access to mine. So I can't even tell if they're infringing my patent anyway. So we don't really bother with that. We just keep it as a trade secret. What was the last question? Or was that it?
Yeah, pretty much. I think just acquisition by large multinationals.
Yeah, I mean, it depends who you are. Some people start companies to be acquired, and that's their exit strategy. I certainly am not. I have absolutely no interest in getting acquired by anybody. I think if you do a good job, you can have a $5, $10, $20 billion company, and that's definitely our goal. And I think a lot of the other entrepreneurs in Australia have a similar philosophy. They don't want to sell out in a hurry, but it's a very different market. We definitely have been approached by primes already to take some stakes in the company, and we're very cautious about that at the moment.
Fantastic. Well, we reaching the end of our discussion time. We've got about 10 minutes left, and there was a poll that we put up around the different areas of the space economy. What areas of the space economy should Australia be focusing on? And coming through number one was telecommunications. So not surprising there, given everything we've been talking about. Chris, what's your view of what areas do you see as you look at it from afar? And obviously, I know you don't like to weigh in too heavily, but from what you're observing, what areas of the space economy do you think Australia should be focusing on?
Oh, yeah, you mentioned connectivity, which I think is very, very important. And you know, all of my Australian friends still complain about the speed of the internet, and you know, it's difficult even for me sometimes to do you know, FaceTime conversations with my family. So I think improving network speeds and latency for Australians in the country and reducing cost is really important as well. I think, you know, universal access to information is absolutely essential, and I think the speed of true high speed broadband in Australia is off the charts compared to other countries. And so that's something that I think people can address and, if necessary, take into their own hands. And then otherwise, you know, Australia is a massive country that's sparsely populated. And I think there's still many technologies needed for keeping, you know, the Australian environment, its ecosystem, its animals, and its people safe. And so there's an uncharted number of technologies that need to be invented and put into the air, into sea, and into space to help address those. And so Australia is in a really unique position, I think, to innovate as sort of, you know, leading stewards of our planet. And I would love to see that. I would love to see a lot of that come from Australia.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I think I'd love to finish with one question to all of you. And you know, one of the things we'd hope to hear from Dr. Cassandra Steer today was around ethics and some of the ethics associated with this. And maybe if you could reflect on what ethical challenges or considerations are top of mind for you as you go forward, and any other final closing remarks. Carolyn, if we can go to you first, please.
Sure. In my research, I deal with a number of populations, so I address ethics all the time. And I think that it's very important to realise that astronauts going into space are people. They have their privacy to consider, they have their own personal journey to consider, and we have to not treat them as machines. And beyond the usual protocols we need to follow with ethics, we really just have to consider their role in space and the missions they're taking part in, and how we can ensure that we keep them safe. And also that we deal with them appropriately. And the same thing we have to think about are the ethical considerations about using the moon and a number of other aspects in space as well. I think it's a very important question.
Thanks. Anthony?
Yeah, no, thank you. So from my perspective, just touching on my earlier response, we want to really have a look at and be mindful of the long-term sustainability of outer space. Like, as we increase its use, everything we do, we need to treat that environment with respect, and that's why I come back to the values of the agency with being responsible. And I think as we continue on, that has to be at front of mind to ensure that we've got that long-term sustainability. But also we need to make sure, though, the rule of law and how our values here on Earth are reflected in space. So I think they're important ones. And my message for everyone who's listening here, the plug that I'll say is that you've heard from all these great speakers, the opportunity in space is here. It's going to be $1 trillion in size of the sector by 2040. It's an important part of our lives, and it helps our way of life. We can monitor drought. We can, like a tangible example is, we can work out where to put water grids in the far north using satellite technology. So this is what we're going to use this all the time. It's going to create the jobs of the future. And the way we'll create the jobs of the future is by inspiring through space. It's Chris's stories, it's Adam's stories, it's Caroline's stories. And we can do it here in Australia. So that's what I just want to leave everyone with.
Thanks, Anthony. And Adam, for you, and you mentioned earlier about some of the things we need to do, particularly in what you're looking at in advance of the election, but thinking about what are the ethical considerations. You also mentioned about the recent cultural heritage agreement that you signed, which was incredibly fast and really interesting to hear about. Love to hear about what ethical considerations are top of mind for you.
Yeah, I'm with Anthony. I think space junk and making sure everybody can use space is top of mind. I'm very against the anti-satellite tests that anybody does. It's very much like polluting the ocean. The whole world needs space. It's not just Australia, and space needs to be clutter-free. You need to be able to operate in space without getting whacked by a piece of space debris or another satellite. So that's something I definitely worry about. I think it's the challenge of the next 10 years is how do we make sure that everybody that wants to operate in space can effectively and easily and safely.
Thanks, Adam. Phil, you've mentioned a little bit already, but tell us more about the sort of ethical considerations and any closing remarks for you.
Yeah, I sort of echo the comments that the other panelists have made. Our mantra is space should be open, shared and safe. So we want to make space more accessible, not just by some people, but by everybody, because it will help mankind do the right thing by people, do the right thing by space citizens, do the right thing for the planet, and don't make space a battleground, even though it's already becoming one. We don't want that, and we are not going to be participating in any offensive capability in that way. We want an open, free and safe space. That's us.
Fantastic. The last word has to go to Chris. He didn't demand this at all, but of course, just we were inspired by when we learned about your seat on the Blue Origin flight. We definitely wanted to make sure we put this together. And so over to you for any concluding remarks.
Well, I think the ethics one is interesting. And I kind of agree with what Phil said about access. So when we were building Planet, we recognized the value of the data that we were collecting. And we were a little frightened that it actually would be misused and abused as well. And at the end of the day, we realized we didn't have any choice but to just make it available. And so, the value of the information is too important to hold it back and to not distribute it to people. And so we do take photos of everything around the world. Some of that stuff isn't very nice, but we might speak for the co-founders of the company who are still working there, really believe in making the world safer through universal access to information. And if you don't have the data on hand, you can't make decisions. You can't blindly operate. And I think we've been doing things like dumping, Adam mentioned space debris. Just realized my camera's gone out of focus. Come back. It may not. But there we go. So, space junk is like an out of sight, out of mind problem. And so is, dumping stuff in the ocean. But if you can see it, then you can do something about it. And I think that's the guiding principle for my view on ethics is you can't change something if you can't see it.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you to all our speakers and our presenters today. Incredible variety of topics that we've covered. I encourage the audience to consider looking at the post-event report that we'll be putting on our website and sharing with everyone who registered for today, because we really want to keep this conversation going and reflect on some of the key points that were made here and continue the connections between overseas Australians such as Chris, such as Carolyn and Andrea Boyd, and those in Australia who are really shaping the space industry. So thank you again for joining. Please stay tuned for our next town hall, which will be in May next year, focused on the topic of climate change. And thank you again for joining, and thanks to our presenters.
Thank you.